Okay, great. Percent. All right. So this was the last slide from Wednesday. So you don't need to write this down, type this down because you already have it. And then usually when we do like a two-parter, I'm usually going to start at the last slide that we covered the day before, all right, just to do a little recap. So on Wednesday, we're introducing section 2, which is mainly talking about evolution, human evolution, the scientific study of our origins as a species of humans. Right? And we talked about how that was a theory that initially was developed by Charles Darwin and then later kind of like translated to our origins. And those who study human evolution, we talked about paleoanthropologists, mainly deal with the kind of study of hominids, which simply is just a term for a creature that walks upright and on two legs. That ability to walk upright on two legs, we determine is referred to as bipedalism. All right, but bipedalism isn't the only thing that is the factor in what makes a species human along the kind of evolutionary tree. There's other factors like skull size and that, but bipedalism is a major one, right? And we were talking about how our textbook essentially kind of is already kind of outdated because we were talking about the classification of early human species, starting with Australopithecine. And know that all Australopithecine discoveries have been found only in Africa, primarily Eastern and Southern Africa, stretching from Ethiopia down to the Great Rift Valley into South Africa. So the first discovery we talked about was the tongue child, credit to the guy named Raymond Dart. Dart was kind of challenging contemporary thoughts that in his theory that man's origins, our missing link, if you will, would have been in Africa. And later he's vindicated, but it takes a little bit of time, all right, particularly after the Piltdown Man was determined to be a hoax. Then his theories are completely vindicated with the discovery of Lucy in 1974, Donald Johanson and the group from Case Western University. And for a long time, Lucy was considered the oldest, most complete, best early hominid. However, that has changed. All right, discovery made in 1994 that in 2010 was official. The discovery of Ardi, also in Ethiopia, pushes the story of evolution back another million years with the classification called Ardipithecus. So when they do the textbook, a few years from now, they're going to have to include that. Like Australopithecine, all Ardipithecus discoveries have been only found in Africa, in East Africa mainly. So that's changed a bit, but Australopithecine is the theory evolves into what we refer to as Homo habilis, which means skillful man. And the skill is essentially the ushering of stone tools. Right? Those stone tools, though, were basically rocks that have been flaked or flinted. They're not used to build things. They're mainly used to crack open the bones of animals that have already been killed by predators to extract bone marrow out of there. All right. And so that bone marrow was a kind of a way for Homo habilis to get more protein. So in evolution, the concept is that species change subtly over time from the physical appearance, but also mentally. They have the ability to kind of look at their surroundings and try to change things so their species will survive. Right. The first major Homo habilis discovery was also found in Africa in the Great Rift Valley called the East Africa Man. The Leakeys, Mary and Louis Leakey, this is where they really made a name for themselves in 1960. Mary then discovers those footprints some 18 years later in real close there in the Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania. The worksheet that you guys had yesterday, the primary source was their son Richard talking about fossil hunting, if you will. So there's an image of the Leakeys, which, like I said, you probably have a similar picture of your grandparents, Nana and Papa, holding the jawbone of a 2 million-year-old hominid. All right. Now, Homo habilis, the theory is, then evolves into our third classification on the evolutionary tree, and that's Homo erectus. The name means upright man. All right. And there's an emphasis here on bipedalism, right? So this first appeared about 1.6 million years ago. prior to the discovery of Australopithecine, this was considered the kind of missing link by many. All right, the thing that separates Homo erectus primarily from Homo habilis. We'll talk about the types of tools that they used a little bit different, but also it's believed that they're the first ones to leave Africa, to venture outside of Africa, and that's because there have been discoveries found outside of Africa, in Asia, a lot of places in Asia, in China and Indonesia, and also the first to use fire, which they believe, as some of the discoveries they found evidence of what would be burning embers that maybe date back to that time. All right. Although the story of fire there's some theory that maybe Homo habilis may have used fire as well. That's again, this chapter is something that's the history is always being challenged. The hypothesis and the theories are always being kind of tested, if you will. All right. So in appearance, Homo erectus is still somewhat primate-ish. All right. The kind of heavier brow. This is a recreation of a skull, Homo erectus. Now, the first major Homo erectus discovery is credited to a guy named Eugene Du Bois. Du Bois is credited with the discovery of a collection of fossil remains referred to as Java Man, named after the island of Java where they were discovered. Now, Du Bois was from the Netherlands. He was Dutch. I have him as a Dutch anthropologist. In reality, he was kind of like an amateur anthropologist. He was a doctor by trade, but he was fascinated by Darwin and evolution. So he actually used his own money to fund an expedition to what is now Indonesia. At the time, it was Dutch East India. It was owned by the Netherlands. And so the story was I think he brought like a team of about 20 guys to help him kind of dig and excavate. He was a little hard to deal with, according to the stories. Matter of fact, by the time he discovered what the remains of Java Man, there was only one guy left with him, and it was this French guy who apparently would cuss him out in French all the time, particularly when they're sitting around eating. So how they communicated, I don't know if Du Bois knew a little French, just didn't know the cuss words. But he essentially returns to Europe thinking that he's going to be basically celebrated as this kind of this major discovery. There's Du Bois, nice mustache. All right. What he discovers here is essentially a part of a skull. The skull cap here, some incisors, some teeth, and a leg bone, which is important here because the leg bone shows some evidence. While it's still a little bit of bowed, it shows evidence of elongation, which means bipedalism, hence the name erectus, right? However, when he goes back to Europe, thinking that he's going to be celebrated here, this is a science, so there has to be some peer review. And so when he's questioned on whether this is a man-like ape or an ape-like man, he gets a little tired and he's temperamental of the questioning. So he basically says, I'm going to take my ball and go home. So he refuses to let anybody look at what his discoveries were to be analyzed. So much so that at one point the government of the Netherlands actually sues him and he loses, and he is kind of forced to turn over his findings. It's later in 1920 when they discover a similar set of bones in China called Peking Man. Peking is the Anglicized or kind of English way of saying Beijing, right? And so they look very similar. And so he's somewhat vindicated. And 4 years later, that's where Dart discovers Australopithecine. So the story really of kind of bipedalism as a kind of a major component in the evolutionary tree was really kind of pushed by Du Bois and others that kind of subscribe to this theory that that's really what the main indicator that kind of separates us from our kind of primate past, if you will. This is kind of a rendering, kind of a recreation of what Peking Man probably would have looked like. Again, you see it's still kind of brutish, if you will, but we're getting closer and closer to a more human appearance. Now, the next two classifications here are a little confusing. All right. So, matter of fact, Homo erectus may have evolved into kind of two separate classifications of humans, and so this is where I find the textbook to be somewhat confusing. All right. Our fourth classification is what we would normally refer to ourselves, Homo sapiens. All right. However, this is not quite us yet. All right. There really should be a different classification for this, but the name itself means wise man. The appearance is about 500,000, 200,000 years ago. Brain size, based on this skull cap, about a third larger than Homo erectus. All right. But this might be one of the classifications in the evolutionary tree that essentially dies out. All right. The kind of the major or the first kind of classification of within this, if you kind of subscribe as our textbook subscribes to it, would be Neanderthals. All right, which really more and more more and more classifications I see it referred to as Homo neanderthalis, which kind of separates us from us, if you will. But this is a term given to the Homo sapiens who inhabited primarily what is Europe and parts of Southwest Asia, like in Turkey and Iraq, places like that. Neanderthals, named after the Neander Valley where a lot of the remains were discovered, are your quintessential cavemen, if you will, because a lot of the remains were in caves. All right. And so the story of Neanderthals tends to be kind of evaluated quite frequently. There is actually evidence that some of the people that are around today have, some people have Neanderthal DNA in their genetic makeup, which may indicate Neanderthals and our modern species of Homo sapiens may have interbred. All right. So like again, like the kind of location of these, when we're mainly talking about Neanderthals, we're primarily talking about Europe. So like there's a lot of discovered in France, in Germany, parts of Spain, all the way down into what is Iraq, Israel, Jordan, those places. Like I said, I'm going to show you guys maps, graphs, and charts throughout this course here, just to kind of add to the story. This map is in French, so I'm trying to church it up a little bit. All right. What Neanderthals look like. This is kind of the kind of recreation we believe Neanderthals looked like. Again, like cavemen, right? Like the Geico commercials, if you've ever remember those when you guys were younger. The thing about, and you're looking at like kind of there is a kind of a definite kind of evolving of appearance, but you'll see also kind of what kind of Neanderthals are wearing. The thing is that it's believed that Neanderthals were the first of the human species to adapt to cold climate. Especially those who were in Europe. So they adapt in a couple of ways. One way, which kind of like where Darwin was talking about, these species essentially kind of change over time. These changes are subtle after generation. But as time goes on, as they live in colder climates, they start to develop thicker bones, thicker skulls, thicker bones, more well-developed muscles. They tend to be kind of shorter, stockier as a means to kind of survive the winter. All right. But also, too, like we were showing there, they were showing in that image there of the kind of Neanderthal wearing fur. All right. That is a kind of a mental evolutionary kind of concept. Right. So like you guys deal with that every day without even thinking about it. So when you guys wake up, like if you guys are going out today, you're not probably going to go to your closet and pull out that full mink chinchilla. Not because you're not major players, because major players do what they want. Haters stand on the sidelines and do what they can, but it's just going to be uncomfortable. All right. So you're adapting to your environment, right? So you're probably going to wear shorts or short sleeve shirt or whatever. In the wintertime, you may pull out the chinchilla. All right. That is a process of a kind of evolution, if you will. So Neanderthals change physically, but also kind of mentally as well. They see an animal, and not only is it, for sustenance, but also for warmth, if you will. All right. This is from an image from a museum in Germany. It's dedicated all to Neanderthals within the Neander Valley. I believe like kind of by Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken. All right. Now, what happened to Neanderthals? Don't write this down because it's for my impending Alzheimer's. It's believed they survived more than 100,000 years, maybe close to 200,000 years. Which is a long time, However, in the evolutionary story, it's a relatively short period of time. But around 30,000 years ago, there's no evidence of kind of like Neanderthal remains. So the theory is that there's some people had believed they may have evolved into our modern species, but more and more there's evidence that our modern kind of Homo sapiens basically lived, or there was some crossover between us and the Neanderthals. So there's some evidence that they may have interbred, but there's more and more evidence there's sort of like conflict, if you will. So what we are, our last classification, what we would call modern Homo sapiens, your textbook calls, it's kind of a silly name in my opinion, Homo sapiens sapiens, which means doubly wise humans. This is us, basically. All right. So more and more texts would classify as modern Homo sapiens. We tend to say Homo sapiens just in general because we don't find there's no other kind of human species. There's no Neanderthals kind of walking around full Neanderthals. So technically, as your text is kind of describes it, is Homo sapiens sapiens. It seems a little silly and redundant. All right. Now, the evidence of our modern Homo sapiens sapiens and the Homo sapiens of Neanderthals kind of coming in contact with one another kind of relates to the story of a kind of a group called Cro-Magnons, which are basically our modern species, the earliest modern species that lived primarily in Europe, the colder regions of Europe, and parts into kind of Southwest Asia. In reality, probably kind of one of those branches that, like Neanderthal, breaks off from Homo erectus. You notice in that image there, this is from a documentary on Cro-Magnons. The guy there is kind of holding a spear, or sometimes what they refer to as an atoll. The Cro-Magnons had different tools than the Neanderthals did. They're using these the ability to hunt from long distance. They were in larger groups, was the theory, although that theory is being kind of tested a little bit. I was watching the History Channel just the other day, happened to have a documentary on Neanderthals called Neanderthal Apocalypse, which talked about kind of some of the misconceptions we have of Neanderthals and some kind of thoughts we have about Cro-Magnons having kind of a distinct advantage over them. Some of those stuff may not necessarily be completely scientifically accurate. But there is evidence that Neanderthals did not have these types of weapons. And if they did, they probably came in contact with Cro-Magnons. The Neanderthals, initially, their kind of tools were a little bit shorter, particularly for hunting closer up, where Cro-Magnons can hunt at a longer distance. All right. So, so you'll see like the theory where we're not the same in that sense. We kind of split at some point because there's discoveries, fossil remains that date roughly around the same time and very real close to each other in location. So the skull on the left is a skull of a Neanderthal. You'll notice the kind of the thicker brow line, the kind of nasal cavity right there. It's definitely larger, and that's an evolutionary kind of change from living in kind of colder climates. And this is that of the Cro-Magnon. All right, who probably they're physically developed more in warmer areas like Africa and Southwest Asia, Middle East. A kind of skeletal comparison here. The one here on the left, these are Neanderthals. They were tended to be shorter, thicker bones. And then you see kind of Cro-Magnons here, which is kind of basically kind of our modern kind of skeletal imagery. All right. So what essentially happened to Neanderthals is related to how the Cro-Magnons maybe kind of had an advantage over them. Now, again, some of the stuff is being tested as a theory. The kind of popular theory is that the Cro-Magnons had linguistic skills, language, ability to communicate. But there may be some evidence that later that they found in certain caves that the Neanderthals may have had that. But until that is like a contemporary belief, we'll go with this. All right. It is proven that they did tend to have longer lifespans than the Neanderthals based on kind of fossil remains, anywhere between 10 to 15 years. So in many cases, in certain areas, they kind of outlived them. And then there's some evidence that they may have kind of interbred with the two, and the Cro-Magnons DNA just tended to be a little bit stronger, I guess. What we do know is that they were artistic in the sense they left behind a lot of cave drawings. And so primarily like in places like France and Germany and some in Spain, you'll find these cave drawings which show just kind of the animals or game that are in the area. The famous one is Luxor Cave in France. And so when Pablo Picasso visited that in the early part of the 20th century, he made a famous statement where he said, "We've invented nothing, we being man." Basically his statement is indicating that being artistic, or basically the need to kind of express yourself artistically, is something hardwired in our DNA. All right. And so, Picasso going through a number of phases and being credited to a number of artistic movements is basically saying he's just a continuation of our basically, or kind of like our Cro-Magnon ancestors, if you will. All right. So this is Luxor Cave in France. Now, this is the paintings were discovered in the 1940s. And you got to keep in mind, France was in the middle of World War II. There's two boys that were playing soccer, and apparently one of them kicked the ball into the cave, and then they went to go get it. And what kids do, they kind of looked around and they saw these paintings and kind of told somebody. So the paintings are pretty detailed. All right, like you'll see a lot of like images of bulls and stuff like that. They would use colors, so you're probably using clay and charcoal and other kind of like heavy iron pigments and stuff. The bull, like I said, is pretty detailed, all right, considering it's hundreds of thousands of years old. And then this is what they believe maybe the first artist rendering of a horse, which looks like kind of an overweight horse, if you will. If that's the case, then it kind of pushes the story back a little bit further when horses made their appearance in what is Europe. Horses originate on the kind of the central steppes there in kind of Russia and that area. So that's kind of debatable. And if that's it looks pretty much like a horse there. However, I think maybe it had been the 80s or 90s. In Luxor, they made a actual recreation of the cave because as more and more tourists came through, people coming through with just their basically breathing and stuff like that, they were diminishing the colors on the cave. So they made a recreation of that. Like an example of that in Spain, there was one in Spain where you see after time there's an outline of a bull that had evidence of kind of pigment on there that essentially that just kind of went away. All right, so that's section 2. All right, you guys have any questions, any concerns? All right, so I recorded this and I'm going to put it up on Google Classroom. So next week, Tuesday, those of you guys are with me on Tuesday, I'm going to finish up the notes on the chapter. And then you guys on Wednesday, I'll do the same. So while my Tuesday group is with me, on my Wednesday group, on Tuesday, I'm going to send you out a worksheet. And then my Tuesday group will get that worksheet on Wednesday. My plan is to test over on Friday on chapter 1. I may have to push it back. All right. But either way, it's open notes. All right. So make sure, though, if you come hybrid, bring your Chromebook. I'm still going to send out the notes like this. I'm going to try to kind of limit the amount of paper that we use. All right. So just bear with me. It's going to be a little bit of a transition, but we'll figure it out. We'll get through it. So if you guys don't have any questions or concerns, you can go about your day. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your Labor Day. Be safe. And I will see you either in class or on the Chromebook. All right.